All right. Well, I wrote in the details here. I wrote all about David, so I won't waste any more time with a great introduction, other than to say, David Law, what you have done in the last month to 6 weeks, raising, when I last saw, it looked like close to 150,000 USD uh, through a Kickstarter campaign to fund this podcast. Is that 10 years now?
Coming up to, yeah, we're just about ticking over to 9 years now. So the one after this, next year, will be our 10th year, and we'll be, I guess, pushing on towards 1,000 episodes of the podcast by then, which, yeah, I think if you'd have told Catherine Whitaker and myself when we were sitting in my parents' dining room trying to work out how to make the recorder start, back in 2012, that we would be doing 1,000 of these, no, I wouldn't have really believed that.
So I was going to say, on a 1 to 10 scale, when you've seen this response, you've done Kickstarters to keep yourselves funded and going, but when you saw this response this time, on a scale of 1 to 10, what was your surprise?
Oh, I think it was a good 9. I mean, I think the strength of feeling we've had over the last year, because we've produced 152 podcasts this year, and with only a few months of tennis. And what's really struck me is just how much people have appreciated the company, just that sort of regular listen. And so I expected, just from the sheer amount of correspondence we had, I expected a positive reaction, because I think people were grateful. We do it out of, I mean, it is a business, but the business model is one of goodwill. It's, we will produce for you and hopefully you will enjoy it, and we will never let you down, and then you back us in return if you feel it's worth it to you. But I think we decided to set a goal of, in pounds, £80,000, which is what, about $100,000. We set that, which was the same as a year ago, and we hit that goal in 2 days, whereas a year ago it took us 40 days. Now, I mean, it's still the same amount of money, but it's just it's
in a pandemic year.
Yeah, it blew me away, to be honest. And the reason we set the same target is because we thought, it is a pandemic. People are really struggling.
Yeah.
We can't ask for any more. But the way that response happened, I couldn't really believe that. No, I couldn't.
And in essence, the way I've looked as I consider it as a subscription. I bought a subscription. So
Thank you, Ted.
No, but I'm saying no, but the point is, I mean, it's Kickstarter. Yeah. And so, yeah, it's not a tax write-off donation, as we would say in America, but it's a subscription. And the number of people that were willing to subscribe to your content in a pandemic time, that, I mean, to me, I was about a 27 on the surprise scale when I saw that, which is, again, an incredible credit to you.
Well, thank you. I mean, I've been working in tennis for over 20 years now, and I've been lucky enough to do a lot of different things. I think I've personally never had a response to anything I've done like this. Commentating on the radio, occasionally you might get a message, but it's rare. And we get several messages every day from listeners who just enjoy that kind of regular conversation, pub type conversation about the sport that we all love, not taking it too seriously all the time, but also making it clear how much we love it. We have that correspondence all the time from people. And I think particularly, as I said, in a pandemic year, so many people in isolation, so many people struggling, not able to see people, not be able to have those conversations themselves with their friends, but they can listen to one. And so, I found that incredibly uplifting, and it just makes us feel like we're doing the right thing, that it's worth it. It's worth these late nights and these editings that we have to do and everything else. It's all worth it.
Do me a favor. Hold up your glass. Hold up your glass. I'm so jealous. I'm sad because it's 1:30 in the afternoon in California. And David, of course, it's later at night.
Yeah.
And as I told you, you were gracious enough to have me on the podcast. And I told you I have a Guinness. It's presently inactive. It's in my garage. It's inactive, although it can be fired up fairly quickly. I do have the cans cold in my beer refrigerator back here, but I can't do it at 1:30 in the afternoon.
It's very much.
But I love because you hit it. Pub conversation is exactly what you do, and that's what's so great about it. I think that's why you get the response you do.
Yeah, no, I think it is. I mean, and it's, although a lot of thought goes into what we need to include in every show and what we need to cover, but we don't really know what's coming next.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Catherine and I have worked together for many, many years. I mean, she worked for me for 5 years in my company, and then we started the podcast. And then Matt, who's our third member, came along as an intern 5 years ago. He was in university and he was a teenager, and here he is now. We're just all equals. So we sit there as just people who are just talking about the sport we love, and we do not know what's coming next. And I think that is part of the appeal, really.
So you listen, as I do, and as many others do. You can tell the love. I'm interested, and I'll share my view, but I want to hear yours first, David. As an Englishman, clearly there's an incredible tennis history. The three of you, your love bleeds through. I'm just fascinated. How do you think you, as English people, see tennis as opposed to how we as Americans or French or Italians or Aussies see the sport? I have some views from listening to you, but I'm curious to hear yours.
I think we're quite cynical about certain elements, and we're sort of waiting for it to go wrong for the players that we like, or the British players, for instance. But at the same time, I think Andy Murray has turned that on its head for us, because he's taught us that British people can win.
Mm-hmm.
So that's changed. I think just generally we're slightly self-deprecating generally. I think that is just part of our characters. But generally speaking, I think we truly love the sport, but we are aware of the capacity and potential for it to be funny, and the sport has so many different storylines, and it just gets the characters of the players out in so many interesting ways, because there's so much pressure. The scoring system of tennis is so ingenious, the way it just puts these pressure points on players. And we tease that a little bit on our show, and it's enjoyable in that way.
Yeah, that's one thing I learned as someone that was brought into tennis early in my professional career. Did not grow up playing the sport, but I quickly found out all points are not equal. And that's one of the things that I think is now starting to finally get more acceptance and understanding when you watch. Because the statistic that we put on screen in American TV that still I scream every time I see it, is total points. What does it mean? I mean, it means nothing. I mean, it can be occasionally an oddity, and I understand. Hey, if we're in the fifth set and one player has 27 more points won than the other, that's an oddity. Okay, it's about all it is. Beyond that, it doesn't mean anything, because points are not the same.
And yet, I still look up that stat occasionally, just because, and not because it means anything, but because I'm just curious, and then I start to. And also because I think it does back up that view that you've just explained of all points not necessarily being equal. That is the perfect way to explain that.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, I don't always think that total points won, it doesn't even describe a feel of the match, because usually a player wins and they feel like the winner, unless something's gone horribly wrong and somebody's lost a load of match points. But I've seen players winning more points on the total points and still they don't feel like the superior player, and the match score overall has borne that out.
David, you know what I find especially listening to your podcast, I'm fascinated by the amount of study that the three of you put into the actual playing of the game, the strokes, players improving on a stroke, declining on a stroke, using serve, et cetera, et cetera. And I find that fascinating. I think that's something that you three really shine at. Whereas in America, I think Americans who watch tennis and follow tennis tend way more to be about the personalities.
Really? That's interesting.
And less about the actual playing of the sport.
Yeah. Well, I think, first of all, the three of us actually just love the sport. We love, I think we're all in awe of them, really. I'm not a tennis player. I've never been I try to play. Catherine tries to play. Matt's a pretty good player. Catherine's was a pretty good player before she hurt her back. I'm by far the inferior one of us at the actual playing of the sport. And yet, the moment that I fell in love with the sport, believe it or not, I fell in love with it because of a personality, and that was Jimmy Connors in the 1991 run to the semi-finals. That's what made me want to work in tennis, that run. And yet, I also remember how he played in that 1991 US Open, and I started to see what these players were doing, and I was just fascinated by it. I was fascinated by the stroke production, the spins they put on the ball, the angles they could create, what those angles would do to an opponent, and I didn't really know. I don't have the background, and I still don't have the knowledge to be an expert in the field, but it completely fascinates me. So we talk about it because we find it really intoxicating just to analyze all that and to see what these players are doing, and also just to hear what some of those that do know, to hear a coach or to hear an ex-player who really does know, and then just put that into our limited understanding. So yeah, I think there is room for that. It can't be too much of any single thing, our podcast. I don't think. You've got to try and have a balance of many.
And David, I've never heard you say that before about Connors 91. And it strikes me because I called, I think, 2 or 3 of his matches. I was fairly early on in my tennis run.
Can you remember which ones?
Well, the Harhouse quarterfinal was the overhead point is one of the single greatest points I ever had a chance to. I mean, you don't really call it, but to be on it and commentating about it, because the stadium went. I mean, it was the old Louis Armstrong Stadium. It just came unglued. I mean, that point was so crazy after a week and a half of buildup of craziness already. Now he's in, and most people think Connors is going to win this match, right? I mean, he's going to beat Harhouse. Most people expected that, but that point was just insane. Anyway, where I was going to say was even that moment, and that was the single greatest in 34 years for me with tennis. That's the best full tournament that I've ever seen. What Jimmy Connors did those 2 weeks and how he captured New York. Yes, he really captured America in those 2 weeks, which is darn hard to do as a tennis player. He did it for 2 weeks. I don't think very many people could tell you how he did it. No. How his tennis at 39 was able to pull that off. That's where I'm going with this. But it was a 39-year-old guy who turned 39 in the midst, beating all these young dudes way past his prime and making this improbable run. It was very much like Jack Nicklaus winning the Masters at age 46. It was very similar, except Jimmy didn't win at the end, but he came way closer. That's like America got so wrapped up in that. Yeah. What he was doing technically to make that happen, I don't remember anybody talking about that.
No. Well, I mean, I remember things he did. I remember him going to the net a lot more and things like that than he had from when I remembered watching him in the early 80s, for instance. But it was, you talk about him grabbing America. I mean, here I am, this teenager who's supposed to be going to college the next day and who's got a really pretty bad attitude at the time. And is just channel surfing at night, 5 hours ahead of you. And here comes this night session match against Patrick McEnroe, and he's 2-1 down. And I'm like, oh, I'll stick this on for a little bit longer. And I'm still there 3 hours later. And, he's grabbed me there at that point, and he has made me fall in love with a sport that I am still working in nearly 30 years later. And that was the inspiration. That was the moment that I thought I have to work in this sport. I have to be around that.
That's great. Before we finish, I want to talk to you about Australia, what's coming up, and tennis in the moment. But since we started on the Connors thing, let me start because you and I shared the incredible honor of calling still the greatest match I've ever seen and the best sporting event I have ever called. I was blessed to call a Super Bowl. I was in a World Series. The best sporting event ever was the 2008 Wimbledon final, and you did such a marvelous job of relaying thoughts in the television documentary that was put together by Tennis Channel and John Wertheim of that. 12 years now, 12 and a half years after the match. When someone says Federer-Nadal Wimbledon, what's the first thing that jumps in your mind?
Yeah, the greatest match of all time.
Yeah.
And I remember doorstepping John McEnroe out of your commentary box straight afterwards. So, you know, I wasn't doing the fifth set. I'd done the earlier parts of the match, and I doorstepped John, and I knew John would not want to talk to me. We knew each other pretty well, but I knew he would be absolutely, totally gone after a match like that. But I had to try. And I just said, John, can you just tell me what we've just seen? And he just said the greatest match of all time. And that tallied with what I thought. And that's what I thought he would say. But I mean, here we are 12 years on, you know, you have a recency bias with these things. It felt like the best I'd ever seen then. It still feels like the best I've ever seen today. And it just had everything, you know, and it encapsulated their rivalry, because you were on Federer's turf. He'd made the extraordinary comeback, and yet Nadal overall has had the better of that rivalry. And that match, to me, sums that up probably better than any of the others, because he was able to take it to Federer on Federer's turf that day.
Right. They were both kings of a hill, and one was going to knock the other one off, the way I thought. And Rafa was the king at clay. Roger was the king of Wimbledon. Roger had some swings at Rafa on the clay, and he couldn't knock him. And Rafa finally got him on the third. It was Rafa's third shot at him in Wimbledon. It's funny you say that, because after the match, in which I had one pee break in 7. We were on the air almost 7.5 hours live continuously. I had one pee break. It was during one of the rain delays. They threw it back to New York for an update, and I was allowed like 3 minutes, and I raced out. But we were just exhausted. Yeah. So we had to ride back to our hotel, which is in Chelsea Harbor. By the time we got back to the hotel, it was close to 10 p.m. Everything was closed on Sunday night. So the hotel agreed to get the chef before he left and make up some hamburgers and sandwiches, whatever. Before we went back downstairs, John calls me and says, come to my room on the way down. So I bang on his door. I go in his room, and he has a special brew.
Of course he does.
Yes, exactly. David knows. If you're an English person, a Londoner, you know what we're talking about. John likes his special brew. But anyway, he had one. We sat there, and he just looked at me. We slumped in his chair, exhausted. He goes, we will never see anything like that again. It's exactly what he said. Now, here's a guy that played the great Borg match it was almost 30 years prior. And he said that night, what he said to you in the immediate moment, this was an hour and a half later, he said, we'll never see anything like that again.
And that's what I love about John, the commentator, is that he takes his own position as part of that discussion, and he's still able to put it into perspective versus what he's just seen. And I think that makes, I think he's an excellent judge in that way. He's realistic in assessing his own place in history. And he loves it. You know, he just loves it all.
The great commentators, and we're blessed in tennis, because I've worked, as you know, I've worked a lot of the American sports, and there's no sport that has as many champions, Hall of Famers that come back as analysts, commentators in the sport as tennis. Nobody. I mean, I go to work every week at Tennis Channel. I'm sitting there with Hall of Famers and champions. This is insane. Point being, John is I can, in 30 years with him, I can count on probably 2 fingers the number of times I've ever heard him say, hey, when I had that moment, this is what I did, right? Which is the chronic thing that a viewer, listener can't stand. Don't tell me about what you did. Tell me what they're doing. And John, as great a player as he was, that you're right on, David. He does not use that crutch at all.
No, I think I remember him working his way through that, because in the mid to late 90s, when I first joined tennis, I worked on the Champions Tour, and I was around him quite a lot. And I think that was when he still could have been on the tour. He was still good enough, you know. And I think at that stage, he was struggling to see the players, and he didn't feel that they cared enough, and he didn't feel they put out enough personality and that sort of thing. And then this group came along, led by Federer, and you saw that transition. You saw him start to appreciate what we'd got then. And I think there's a maturing process for a player going from being an athlete themselves to becoming a commentator or a pundit. It's not that easy to retire in your 30s, and he did that, and he became the best in my eyes, and I think it helped him that he suddenly discovered in Federer, Nadal, Djokovic, Serena Williams, and a few of these other players that he respected as even being greater than he was, and I think that helped his transition.
Most sports that I've worked in the US, the former players will all tell you the best thing they do is take time. There's a gap between when they stop playing and they start commentating.
Yeah.
And it's why you just outlined that. And it also, each year that goes by, there's a little bit of just an evolution. So if you wait 2 years, there's slightly fewer players that are playing that you played against. So your ability to be honest is a little greater. And that's what I'm saying. John didn't have that gap. John went right from, in the process of retiring right up the first year to work with me at the Open was after he got knocked out. It was his last Open. He played it. And as soon as he lost, he came up to the booth. And that was I think that's what you're getting at, the suddenness of that transition. And suddenly I just played this guy 2 weeks ago, and now, he's getting his tail kicked and I've got to criticize him. It's a hard thing to do.
Yeah. And I'm sort of always interested to watch the transition of Andy Roddick as somebody who could clearly be one of the great commentators. And, has a young family, and he didn't want to just jump straight back on the tour and go in commentary booths around the world. But he's dipped his toe in, hasn't he, with Tennis Channel. And the last year he did the years of Fox Sports doing other sports. But there's never a time that he talks about tennis that I'm not interested in what he's going to say. And I think that will probably grow as the years go by.
Couldn't agree more on Andy. And the other person that could do this, and he did one match in his life, and I was blessed. It was with me and John at the US Open. And he's a savant. It was utterly brilliant, but has had no interest in doing it full time, is Agassi. Yeah. And the year after Andre, the first year of his retirement, he came back to the US Open for some sort of a sponsor thing, I forget. But I think it was the day before, they called me and said, Andre would be interested in doing the match tomorrow night. What do you, obviously they're going to do it. They're kind of running it by me out of courtesy. Okay. So I just said, understand now, if you have 3 people and it's John and Andre, my position now, I have to literally step away in the background. And so just understand that you're not going to hear very much from me because no one wants to. Mm-hmm. And that's the way it played out. And the match was Federer against Roddick. It was a quarterfinal at the Open, US Open. And it was the match. That's where Andre let out the Boris Becker tell. He talked about it on the match that night. We were looking at each other like, where'd that come from? None of us had ever heard anything about that. And then eventually people went and found video. And I think most of the video was Wimbledon because the camera angles of Wimbledon are so spectacular. They got Boris Becker, doing the tell with his tongue, which Andre, being a Vegas kid, growing up around card playing, learned how to tell a tell.
That's extraordinary.
It was amazing. He put this out there that night and we were like blown away. Where did this come from? So Andre, and I've done some other events with Andre where it's been education based, which has been his post-tennis focus. And he's extraordinary. But to his credit, he's never been almost 15 years now. He has not wanted to get back into the tennis commentary thing at all. No. So, sorry, I got long-winded there. Apologies.
No, it's fascinating.
Yeah. Well, all right. So where we are as we're talking here in the beginning of January, we were just chatting before we started the record here that, we're both sitting around trying to wait and see what's going to happen in Australia. What are our respective duties going to be? Obviously we're not going, no one's going. No. In the commentary world, but are they going to play? Where are they going to play? When are they going to play? And as I was saying to David about 4 hours ago, I was on the phone with my employer's Tennis Channel, and they're still trying to get exact dates and schedules nailed down with Tennis Australia for the events leading into Australian Open, not just the AO. Have you heard the same, David?
Yeah, and it was an interview I think Craig did with Tennis Channel that instructed my latest information, which was how they're going to have the top seeds in Adelaide,
Yeah.
and playing an exhibition before going to the ATP Cup and doing their quarantining there, and just the magnitude of and the frequency with which obstacles come up for Craig and his team to have to deal with in order to keep the show on the road and keep us going in the direction where an Australian Open can happen is something I don't think we've ever seen before, really. I mean, the US Open had to do an incredible job to make their event work. I remember James Blake doing an interview with us on the podcast some weeks before, and he said, I don't see a scenario that looks good for the US Open. How can this go well? And yet, I think on the whole, it did go pretty well. And that's, his fears were very on very solid ground, and yet they managed to pull it off. And yet, I think there is, even though there's a month to go, and they've done a great job to get to this point, we've still got players tweeting, "I don't have a flight yet, and I'm supposed to leave in 6 days." And there's still a lot to work out, I think. I mean, not to say I don't think it'll happen. I think that they will make it work, because I think that that's the kind of guy Craig Tiley is. I think that's the kind of innovative association that Tennis Australia is. I do think that they are excellent at this stuff, and thank goodness they're in charge of it. But they have their hands full, and rather them than me.
Yeah, I had never been to the Australian Open until this, well, now 12 months ago. And I had always heard all of the great tales about it, and it lived up to everything. It lived up to everything I'd heard. So I completely agree. Having gone to the US Open and Roland Garros post-pandemic or in the midst of pandemic, and seeing what efforts those two entities put forward to make that happen. It was, like I said it to you on your pod, David, it was extraordinary to me. And I know there were a lot of couch critics, and that's a very easy thing to do. When you were there and seeing it, you saw the efforts that were put out. It was amazing with minimal problems. There were some, but minimal. This one to me is probably 5x the difficulty, because you're dealing with an island continent, therefore has totally contained. And as we were saying, they're not 2% tolerant about, there's zero tolerance cases. So we're all want it to happen. If this happens, Craig Tiley should have a statue put up for him outside Rod Laver Arena.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And it's not what I expected. If we'd have gone back to 8 or 9 months ago, my view was, Australian Open have got lucky, haven't they? They got their tournament in, they played it, and then the pandemic struck, and they've got all this time to sort everything out for next year, and everything will be fine by then. I had not imagined that they would have to run into this many issues. So yeah, full credit to them if they can make it all work.
All right, if you could, let me go macro with you here, because you've been around the sport for your life and you're so knowledgeable. What would, again, the wish list? It's a little bit of what Wertheim asked Craig Tiley this question yesterday, a little bit like it. But if you could do one thing right now, the wand wave, one thing post-pandemic for tennis, what would it be? Because I definitely have one that I would wish to do, which would be, I'll tell you first, so you take a few seconds to think. I would love to see we have the 4 majors, and then we've had 9 ATP Masters, which are basically the next best thing. I would love all 9 of those to be combo events. We have 13 events over 52 weeks that the men and the women were together. And somehow, just to me, you're never going to blend the tours completely. I don't think that's realistic from the business angle, but that to me could be done. And I would love to have 13 significant combined, just events where the best players in the world, I don't care who they are, the best players in the world are there.
Yeah, well, I think as a business proposition, that is an incredibly strong one, because the sport is at its strongest, as the slams show, when the men and women are together. No question about it. I think I would add on to what you've just requested, because I'm quite happy to go with what you've got, Ted.
No, I know, but I'm asking.
But I would add on to that
Yeah.
A team event that makes sense, that is the team event, and it is mixed, that it is men and women playing, that everybody can get behind, everybody cares about, and everybody schedules their calendar so that they fit it in, and there's no conversation about it.
So would you say combining Davis Cup and now what's called the Billie Jean King Cup?
Yeah, and the ATP Cup, just throw them all in, whatever it takes, so that all the associations and everybody in tennis just gets behind one, so that it feels like it should feel, because none of them feel like they should feel.
Right.
It's just too diluted, it's too fragmented, and yet imagine it if it could be done in that way. And I think that if anything good is to, there are good things to come of the pandemic. Sensible decisions can be more likely to be made because of the fact that everything has been thrown up in the air the way it has. And I just feel that if they could plot those 13 important points of the calendar in a sensible way, and plus a team event, that would be something good to come out of all of this.
What I was thinking, David, and I understand this is likely a pipe dream, but when I was listening to Craig Tiley talk yesterday, what I was thinking was the greatest leader in American sport right now is the commissioner of the NBA, Adam Silver. And he's just been spectacular. And when he first took over the job, which I'm going to say was 5 years ago, his first move was to physically travel to meet, and I'll throw a dart and say the top 10 players in the NBA, meet them in their turf and just listen to them. And that's what I was waiting to hear, because that's what I hope comes out of pandemic. It seems to have taken place to some degree, but I'm hoping it becomes a permanent presence, is that the leadership in tennis talks with the players, not at them, not to them, with them. And that includes listening. And I know there's been individual examples where that's happened. David Haggerty of the ITF did a fabulous job of that at the US Open when he was running the USTA. And he went to the top players and listened to them. It's the obvious, the usual suspects, but he listened to them about the things that the US Open needed to do. And David, to his credit, did most of them and made the US Open a much better event for the players. And those are the examples that have happened, but I hope that becomes something that we just is a permanent presence in tennis.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think one of the issues is the sport lacks that figure that you talk of. It lacks a commissioner. It doesn't have a decision maker that can bring all of this together and make a call. It's so difficult to get anything done in tennis. And so, I don't know how you do that with all these associations that the sport has, but my word, could it do with it?
Yeah, no, that's exactly. Last one. What's your thought on this proposed Djokovic, Pospisil? I don't know how else to say it, but to me, that's a union. What they're proposing is to form a union, which in American sport has led to massive amounts of work stoppage, strife, unrest, most notably in American baseball. That's been the most harmed sport by the management union lack of relationship. So anyway, and I'm not an expert at all, so I don't profess to be one, but listening to what they proposed, it sounds to me like they're talking about a union.
Yeah, well, I think they are. I understand it, and I can see the importance and point of a players' union. I really can. I mean, in that it just them to have a proper voice. Right, I think it's always been one of the problems of the tours. This kind of conflict of being half owned by tournaments and half owned by players, or half representative of, and they inevitably want different things. And you've got a CEO in the middle who often can't vote either way. So that is a problem. But at the same time, I question the timing of it. I really do. I just don't understand how it's doing anything for the greater good of the sport to be trying to have this out now. I mean, when Andy Roddick tried it about 7 or 8 years ago, I thought that was a good timing, and the sport was doing incredibly well, and it was about the piece of the pie that you were trying to get, and he still didn't get really what he was hoping to. I mean, they did get a lot more, but to be doing it now, especially in the middle of a pandemic.
And being at the U.S. Open, David, when that went on, I mean, obviously there were not many people there. Those that were there were all of that. And I can never prove this, but to me, there's no question in my mind, there's a connection between that and Djokovic snapping on the court,
right,
and being defaulted. To me, I can't disconnect those two things from happening.
Well, when you consider that, I mean, I interviewed Janko Tipsarevic for an hour and a half on the podcast in April of last year, and he thought that Novak was losing his mind trying to do all this stuff. And he's one of his best friends, and he's saying, I'm telling Novak, don't do this. You're using all your energy up. His own coach, Goran Ivanisevic, doesn't think it's a good idea. Marian Vida, his other coach, doesn't think it's a good idea. I mean, I kind of credit Novak for persisting. It's that important to him that he just ignores them all and ignores the damage it might do to his career, and he still does it anyway. But I do think it's damaging.
Yeah. I want to get to the podcast in a second, but Novak to me I've met other athletes in other sports that are like this. He's one of the more complicated guys because there's so much that you admire about him, and having been around him in some other events and just seeing more in his earlier years than recently, but still there's a lot of admirable qualities to Novak, and he's clearly smart, and he thinks, and he cares tremendously about his country, about Serbia, but then he does things that make it so hard, and that's the part that's why it's complicated, right? Because everything, you admire the guy, and then he does something, go, how can someone so smart do that?
Yeah, it's a shame.
Yeah.
It's a shame, really. I mean, he is his own worst enemy sometimes, I think, to be honest. And, I think often he means well, and he just seems to get it wrong. He just seems to misjudge the moment or the tone, or, like the Adria Tour, he meant well,
right?
But I mean, it was just the worst decision to run that event the way they did.
And that's, what I wish after the Adria Tour, I wish he had stood up and just said the most powerful words in the English language. I'm sorry. Just say, I'm sorry. We meant well, and it failed. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Would have calmed everything if he had done that. Your podcast, and we're going to finish here. You mentioned the interview you did with Tipsarevic last year, which was fabulous. And as great as the podcast is, I've told you this, keep doing those. You can't do all of those, but mix those in. Yannick Noah, you had another tremendous, Marian Bartoli. I'm thinking off the top of my head, and you probably can rip off 5 or 6 more. Those are outstanding, because not often do we get to hear those significant players in the sport in a long form. And that's what you do so well.
Well, thank you. I think we pick and choose, in as much as when we started, I thought we had to be an interview show. I did not think anybody would want to listen to us. I really didn't. I'm not trying to just be, modest here, so in false modesty, but I just thought, why would anybody listen to us? Nobody knows who we are. And so we started and we did interviews, but sooner or later we just sort of ran out of people to talk to that we knew, in order to keep it going on a weekly basis. So we mix and match, really, and we are this regular outlet. But I mean, I think the other one I did last year, Larry Stefanki, which was just, I couldn't believe what I'm hearing from the guy. And it is that long form opportunity, and it is just, let these people, they've got so much to say, I love it.
And, you just did, on your pod yesterday, I guess it was, you did a little notice of some of some tennis people we lost, in Bob Brett, and a wonderful writer. I never had a chance to meet Tom Parada, but obviously read his work. And we should also send, because this is obviously, anybody listening to us now is a tennis person, send our best to Larry Stefanki. I reached out to Larry. Larry's son passed away about a month or 6 weeks ago. Was an actor. In his 30s, sadly passed away.
I'm so sorry to hear that.
Yeah. So I reached out to Larry, and I know he's, it's been a rough obviously rough time for Larry and his family. So anybody in the tennis world that knows Larry knows what a sparkling guy he is.
Oh, absolutely.
So we should make that little public acknowledgement. Sadly, we're doing way too many of these in this time. But anyway, David, thank you. This has been great. And so I bled past 30. So you clearly will have another pint to go, won't you?
Oh, absolutely. In your honor.
I am holding out the most fervent of hope that we can share a pint at Wimbledon in person on the rooftop this summer.
I would love that.